So we are in day number 7. And today we're talking all about waste. We're talking about garbage. This is going to be a fun topic, and it's something that has been in the news a lot recently. And there's a lot of people talking about it. And for good reason, because if we address waste, we tend to address a lot of the other issues within that food, in terms of the sustainability equation, water, energy, and food. So the reality is with waste, it, like energy and water, is pretty cut and dry in terms of what we want to do or don't want to do. It is more complicated, though, in finding the solutions. And there's many ways to do it. And so that's what we're going to spend a lot of time on today. We're going to talk a little bit about, waste in general, but we're going to really spend most of the time addressing what happens in food service and how we can look at it. The problem of waste is completely interconnected. It is an enormous problem that we're going to see, and it's totally interconnected across all phases of energy, water, and food. For food service, it represents an expense to remove waste. It's also an opportunity to improve your operations from a business standpoint, which we're going to talk about. You reduce food waste, you increase bottom line, and that's just the way it works. So there's no reason in the world that every restaurant shouldn't be focusing on food waste as a good business practice at the very least. But for food waste on a global basis, it's a problem on many levels. It's a problem that deals with global hunger, growing population needing more food, etc., and yet we waste so much food. And it's also a big problem for climate change, and we're going to see that as we go through the presentation today. So the reality is, waste happens. Waste has happened ever since the beginning of humanity. In fact, we when we do archaeological digs, many times we're looking through the garbage of past civilizations to understand what they ate, how they cooked, etc. So the reality is, populations will always produce waste. That's just part of being human. The reality is, though, that how we're dealing with this has changed dramatically. And today, what we have moved to is largely the concept of a landfill. And landfill is basically a huge hole in the ground that you put everything into, and then you cover it with dirt, and the waste kind of goes away and out of our sight. And it seems to make sense. The first landfill actually began in 1935. So it's not a it's a rather new thing to humanity. There's other things that people do with waste. They for instance, they will burn it, let's say. And the issue there is, of course, that when you burn waste, you can create various pollutants, and you're creating, gases that contribute to global warming, etc. So it's also not a great, solution. And the problem with landfills, we're going to see there's a huge problem we're going to get into momentarily, but also, landfills, when you put stuff into the ground over time, and everything is mixed. It's leftover paint and chemicals and food and plastics and paper and all kinds of things. What happens over time is that a lot of times the pollutants leak out and get into the groundwater. And now we have a problem of pollution. Going back to yesterday, that 1% of consumable water, we also pollute it through how we deal with waste. And that's a really huge problem. So we are a wasteful world. We live in a wasteful society. If we think about how, with things like technology and how fast we change technologies, the reality is we live in a disposable society where we throw out simply too much. And in fact, many of the products today are designed to have short shelf lives and to be disposable. So global waste is skyrocketing. Global municipal waste production is slated to double by the year 2028, to double. That's an enormous increase in the amount of waste that we have to do. And on top of it, the amount of waste per capita is also increasing. So if you go back to day one, where the population's increasing and the amount of waste that we're producing per person is also increasing, that becomes an enormous figure. And so, for instance, in the year 2002, waste in the world's cities was basically at 0.64 kilos per person, now per day. That now has increased to 1.2 kilos per person per day. And by 2025, that's estimated to be at 1.42 kilos per person per day. So we are creating more and more waste in general that we have to deal with. It is an enormous problem. And if we think specifically about food waste, again, is a problem because we, frankly, of the world's food production, around a third of it, and I've seen statistics, 30 to 40%, is lost or wasted annually. Now, in a world that has a growing population where hunger is an issue, and where we have populations whose growth is stunted because of the lack of nutrients, or perhaps disease is high, or people die at very young ages because of this, it's unconscionable that we lose so much food. Now, I also want to be clear that when we talk about this 30%, 40% figure, that's not just happening in restaurants. That's happening across the board. That happens from waste in the fields, to waste in transportation, to waste in distribution, to waste in preparation, and that's our homes, our restaurants, etc. So it's at every point along the way. Interestingly, in more developing countries, the waste tends to happen on the front end of that equation, and that is on the growing and distribution side, where the waste in more developed countries tends to happen on the other side of the equation, which is at preparation and consumption. So it is a massive, massive problem. And of course, to compound it, most of the food goes into landfills. And this is where things get really interesting, because a lot of people think, okay, I put my banana peel into a garbage. My garbage goes to a truck. The truck goes to a big hole in the ground. It dumps it in there. And then, of course, it's just going to biodegrade and turn into, soil. That is incorrect. And the reason it's incorrect is when you put food into a landfill, it is covered over with more and more stuff and eventually dirt. And the thing that's missing, that you need to break down food into rich soil, is oxygen. And without oxygen, there's anaerobic bacteria that take over and break down the food waste. And what that produces, what those bacteria produce, is methane. And the methane bubbles up from underground and then eventually is released into the atmosphere. The problem with methane is it is 21 to 25% more damaging, 21 to 25 times more damaging to the environment than carbon dioxide is. So essentially all over the world, and by the way, anaerobic activity underground, it happens very slowly. What that means is that we have ticking time bombs all over the world called landfills that are slowly bubbling methane into the atmosphere, and that methane is destroying the atmosphere, contributing to global warming 21 to 25 times worse than carbon dioxide. It is a huge, huge problem. And the gases that come out of landfills are 50% methane. So we have an enormous problem. In fact, if we think about the contributions to global warming, 11% of that is from global methane emissions. So waste is a huge problem, and how we dispose of food waste is a huge problem. By the way, in terms of countries that have sort of the worst problems when it comes to the landfills and the methane, is the USA were on top, followed by China, Mexico, Russia, and Turkey in that order. So it is a problem. Now the issue is that we're producing more and more garbage, and more of that is going into the ground, and thus will produce more and more methane. Now today there are more advanced landfills that are trying to capture the methane, because methane actually is a great source of energy if you burn it. And so they're trying to do that, although it's still not a perfect system. And the other issue is that as we produce more and more waste and the landfills fill up, Then you have to find space for another landfill. And those landfills tend to be further and further away from population centers. So how everything is connected here, we wind up using more energy to transport our waste further distances. As we've said a million times throughout this whole thing, everything is interconnected. So let's take a look at where food waste happens in our kitchen. Now, what's really interesting is that when I talk to chefs about food waste, the conversation almost immediately goes to composting. And we've heard a lot about composting and how we should be composting. But I think the biggest question is, before we even get to composting, and we'll get there today, is about why do we have food waste in the first place? And so the first thing we want to do in our food service establishments is look at how can we reduce the overall food waste to begin with. And that's not only good for the environment, but that is exceptionally good for our businesses, because if we reduce the food waste, and if we think about what that means, we, the restaurant, purchased the food, we spent the money on it with the hope that we would sell it and make money on it to contribute to the bottom line. Now, if we bring in food and that food is wasted, it is not served to the public, and it doesn't generate profit or revenue, then it becomes an expense and hurts our bottom line. So that's the way it works, very simply. Now, what we're going to take a look at in the following slides here is 4 different parts of our business: purchasing, food preparation, storage and equipment, and menu planning. And under each one of those 4, there's basically 2 subcategories for each one, and that is spoiled and excess food and prep waste under each one of those 4. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about is tracking our food waste, and that's a really important part of running our business. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. How do you know how much you're actually wasting? And the reality is, most of the food service operations, if I were to ask you today, how much food waste do you produce, and from what department is it coming from, and from what shift is it happening during, most people shrug and say, I don't know. And yet that should be part of our business. So if we look at, for instance, purchasing. So purchasing, and by the way, the next 4 slides are really, this is what you will get. You'll get much more, obviously, in the food waste challenge. And really what the food waste challenge in these 4 slides are designed to do is to get you thinking about your kitchen that you work in. And where are the potential problems for food waste reduction? And the reality is, or for food waste, and the reality is, if you look at these different areas, you will find unquestionably that certain areas produce more waste. And those are the areas that you sort of attack and focus on and say, okay, how can we reduce food waste? So for instance, when we purchase food, what are the things that can contribute to food waste reduction, to food waste in general? The wrong, inferior food. Food comes in and it's not of sufficient quality, or maybe it's too old, or maybe we ordered too much and it's not in alignment with the amount of business that we're doing. Again, the quantities that are brought in, is it the right food in general? Does it align with the product specs that we want for our business, that we need for our recipes? And the thing here is, we can work very, very closely with our purveyors to also look at things like pack sizes, to look at things like delivery times, to be sure that the quality is where it needs to be, so you don't bring something in and that's perishable, and 2 days later it's no longer fit for consumption. We can also take a look at the food preparation areas within our kitchens, and ask ourselves these questions. So in those areas, is food waste happening because we're just making too much food, and there's not the right interaction and connection between the amount of business that we think we're going to have versus the amount of production that we're making? And how can we bring those more into alignment? Or maybe somebody's making the food and it's just not satisfactory and we have to redo it again. Maybe perhaps it was burned or whatever, and maybe that's an issue of training that we have to address. Usable food. Were we cutting too much off, etc.? Was the food not prepared to the recipe? Were the portions too big or too small, etc.? And, really what we're looking at here is many times it's observation, it's measurement, and very importantly, it's training. Because we bring people in to work in our establishments. People are people, and people make mistakes. And sometimes the training isn't sufficient, or we're having them do things that they're not really qualified to do. So that's one thing to look at there. Food waste reduction, we can look at storage. How is food being stored? And I know that from, many days in restaurants, how many times, I would walk into the refrigerator and find things that kind of got lost. Maybe they got pushed into the corner, etc. And maybe they weren't rotated properly, or the food wasn't properly labeled, and we weren't sure when it was prepared, and we had to throw it out. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in the storage of food. And it is so important that we also track this, because, and then we can understand what are the things we need to do to change this. Also, we can look at things like maintenance. Now, this goes back to when we talked about energy. Is our equipment running at peak performance? Are the refrigerators sufficiently cold? Do we have employees who are propping open doors, and all of a sudden their temperatures are going up, and the storage times then are reduced, and things are going bad before they should? Again, are we not rotating stuff? What is the issue of maintenance and training of our staff, and how do we get them to understand how to not waste food in storage? And then we look at menu planning, and a lot of this can start actually with the chef. And when we prepare our menus, and when we think about the recipes we want to do, how can we do that with an eye towards food waste reduction? How can we do that so that we use all of the product? So we can actually strategically look at leftovers and know how we're going to use the leftovers. How are we going to use the trim? How can we turn that into other menu items, etc.? And that is nothing more than a well-oiled kitchen that is also maximizing profits. I think along these lines, we need to also think about things like buffets. And, I know a lot of places really believe they must have buffets, but buffets also can be extraordinarily wasteful when it comes to food waste. And, if I could eliminate all buffets tomorrow with a wave of my magic wand, I would do so. That's probably not realistic. But I think that, one question is, do you have to have buffets where you work? And the second question is, if you do, then how can you strategically be sure that the amount of food you're wasting is minimized? And do you measure how much food you waste per buffet? Can you bring out smaller and smaller portions, or create more action stations, etc.? What are the things that you can do? You can also look at things like, what about the bread you put on the table when, guests sit down? Do they need a big basket of bread? Much of that will go into the garbage if it's not consumed. There's ways to do that. Think about things like, if you're in a situation where there's a cafeteria, do you give them a tray or not? And there's well-published data on, if you give people a tray that they can put their food on, they tend to take more food than they're actually able to consume, versus having to carry a plate and go back maybe a couple different times. So the reality here is, and this is really what the food waste challenge is all about. How do you do this? We just went over very quickly 4 basic areas in the kitchen that you can kind of dissect and look at, where are we wasting the food. But the reality is that anything that is not measured doesn't exist. And so the first thing that we have to do in any kitchen where we're looking at understanding food waste is to understand how much we're actually producing in the first place. And that is to create a baseline. And you do that by weight. And then you determine from what department was it coming, and you determine, from what shift. And now you have really actionable data. And then you can start to ask those questions about, was the waste preventable? Again, you can't reduce everything, most likely. There's always going to be something, perhaps, that you can't use. Although there are restaurants in the world that get very, very close to zero food waste, which is impressive. And once you sort of understand that, is this waste preventable? Then you look at, okay, so what are the steps I can do to improve that? And some of the things here to think about is really how do you turn this into, you know, a game? How do you get everybody involved? And now we jump back to one of the first things we talked about on day one, which is education, and educating our staff about, okay, how do you do this and why are we doing it? And talk about the global impact of food waste and how it is the desire of wherever you work that this becomes part of good business, is to reduce that. And you set up a tracking system and everybody sort of takes part in this. And what we do and what we've learned in this actually is that chefs don't like to lose. And if you start to give chefs goals and say, we want to reduce our food waste by such and such, and you track it day after day, and you show where are we trending, a lot of times actually the staff will find ways to actually beat it. And that's really incredible. So get everybody involved. That's one of the things that's so critical. It can't just be the chef doing it. So, and by the way, a lot of that is covered in much more detail in the whole food waste challenge. Again, I encourage you to take a look at that. Let's look at some other areas sort of outside of direct food waste, and one of them is grease. And many of us have deep fryers in our establishments, and one of the things about grease is that the fats that we get rid of is that they are they can be reused. They can be reused for a lot of things. So if you're not separating the fats and having them be picked up separately, and in some instances, people will actually either pay to get those picked up, so you actually make some money on it, or at the very least, you break even where you're not paying somebody to remove the waste from your establishment. Because what we can do with that fat, as you can see on this slide, is we can use it in a lot of things, animal feed, cosmetics, etc. We can use it as biofuel, and that actually is something that has a lot of promise, and from a sustainability standpoint is a really good thing to do. So what are the other things we can do with food waste? Obviously we're going to have some, in all reality. And then what do you do with it? Again, the first step in food waste is, why do we have it in the first place? And then what's left over, we need to ask the questions about, can we give it for human consumption? There's a lot of hungry people in the world. Now, the answer to this is, number one, whatever food you give must be safe and sanitary. And secondly, depending on where you live in the world, sometimes there are laws that prevent that from happening. I have also seen how chefs, even in some areas with those laws, have done some pretty amazing things to kind of get around it a little bit and still serve very healthy food to people who desperately need it. Anyways, but I'm not going to go into. But chefs are great problem solvers, and I've seen amazing things happen. And then secondarily, can we give the food to animals? Is it possible that that can become animal food? And then lastly is composting. And how does that happen? And how does that work? And by the way, when I talk about this, when we talk about food waste, it's not only what's generated in the kitchen. It's also what's being generated in the dining room. We talked about buffets, but when food comes back from the dining room and it's being, excess food left on plates, and you scrape the plates, be sure to scrape those plates into containers that contain only food waste. And that can be, composted, et cetera, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. That's a very important thing to train your staff on. And by the way, and this is common sense also, if the food portions or plates are coming back with a lot of food left on it, you as a chef, that should be a little bell in your head saying, wait a minute, maybe I'm serving too much food and maybe my portions are too big. And that becomes then part of that question about how can I reduce waste overall. So food waste for animals, we're going to sort of jump through a number of these slides. The reality here is just a couple of things. Obviously, if you can find a way to do this, this is great. For many people, this is not applicable. It's not possible. Can you work with farmers? Do the laws wherever you live, do they allow for this, or is it illegal? And then, of course, you would never ever want to serve, an animal's own DNA. We saw that in that resulted in things like mad cow disease, etc. Now, composting is something, again, that's received a lot of attention. And the way that composting essentially happens is that composting is what was sort of done through human existence, where food waste was basically broken down. It was broken down with oxygen. And when that happens, it's basically oxygen and heat due to microbes and to worms, and that would turn into the most rich soil, very, very, very rich in nutrients, which was used as fertilizer. So in effect, it was continuing the cycle of life where, always you take the leftover, the waste, and that becomes the nutrients for the next generation, and the circle continues. The problem is when food waste goes into a landfill, that food waste, which represents a lot of great nutrients, then is effectively taken out of the cycle of life. And as a result, it becomes completely wasted. And frankly, the nutrients are lost forever. Now, one of the things is if you're composting, and hopefully there's a way that you can do that where you are, it is really important that we make sure we have training in the kitchen so that little things don't wind up in the compost bin that don't belong there. Stickers, plastic, rubber bands, etc. That is a huge problem. And frankly, this goes down to training your staff, and it also goes down to making it part of their performance. Just like you would say, if somebody is burning too much of the food they're preparing or working too slowly, you would say, that's not a really great employee. Well, if they're not adhering to the rules about composting within your establishment, that is equally a problem for them from a performance standpoint. So there's a lot of different types of composting. I'm not going to get too much into this right now. I encourage you though to look at this later. But windrow composting was the original way of doing it. Put it in piles, turn it over, let nature take its course. There's another type in which you sort of keep it stacked up, but you blow oxygen into it, and that aerates it and allows it to compost. There are some ways of composting in vessels, which can cure things up, speed things up quite a bit. And then there's anaerobic digesters, in which that actually is a way of taking waste and turning it also into energy. We see that a lot in manure with large agricultural operations, in which we can take manure, which is a pollutant in those large amounts, and actually turn it into energy. Now, the interesting thing here is we also have there's also some equipment that exists that some food service establishments use that effectively dehydrate the food very, very quickly. Now that'll basically takes out the moisture and allows it then to be composted or mixed directly into the soil as nutrient. The problem with those systems is they are very energy intensive and take up space in your establishment. Nonetheless, it's a great option because, as you see at the bottom here, not every location allows for composting. And I can't tell you how many chefs I've talked to across the world who have told me, I would love to compost, but there's no way that I can compost. I don't have the space to do it. I don't have the staff to do it where I am. We produce way too much food waste to handle. Or frankly, it's just illegal. Or frankly, there's nobody who will take my food waste. And, unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for that, except to go back to the power of the white jacket. And, I just want to be sure that we never forget that we, as the chefs, have a lot of power and can influence a lot of people. And especially when we band together, we can change the world. And sometimes it's slow and sometimes it's frustrating. But if your chef societies, reach out to the politicians and the people who do the waste management and demand that we want a composting solution. And by the way, that looks great from a PR standpoint in terms of your clientele. You can change, and I've seen examples of that happening. If it happens slowly, don't lose hope. Also, as chefs, sometimes we have to manage up as well. And that's an important thing also. I've had other chefs come to me and say, look, I'd love to do this stuff, but management has no desire to do any of this. And unfortunately, I don't have the magic solution there either. But I think the important thing to point out is all of this is good for business. Looking at food waste, reducing it, that's good for business. Any manager should be in favor of that. And being that establishment that focuses on sustainability efforts, that helps attract a clientele that wants to see this kind of thing. And a lot of times those are very good customers to have. Now, non-food waste. So, this is all about recycling. And if we think about recycling as kind of that cycle of life, but in terms of glass or plastic or metals, that effectively you can take an aluminum can and you can, for pretty much all of eternity, keep turning that into a new can over and over and over again. It is a precious resource. But if we throw it into a landfill, we lose it forever. And then we have to mine more aluminum out of the ground and turn that into cans. And that requires, basically, if you recycle aluminum cans versus making them from new aluminum, you save 95% energy. So recycling is really the solution. And just some statistics. Now, these are US statistics and they're a little bit outdated, but it's amazing what we can do. And going back to that idea of the totality of all of our decisions. For instance, and these go back a little bit, in the US, we were recycling, as of about 8 years ago, 13 million glass jars and bottles every day. 13 million. And there's still so much more that can be done. In the US, in 1 year, 54 billion cans were recycled. Billion. And that saves the energy equivalent of 15 million barrels of crude oil. So recycling is a very, very positive thing to do. Now, that also goes down to training, and you have to train your staff on how to do it so the right stuff winds up in the right places. And in addition, that when you do so, that the food is ready to be recycled, which means you can't put dirty food. Like, for instance, if you have cans, they have to be washed out. You can't put cans coated in food into recycling. That doesn't work. And that's all part of training. Other things to look at in your establishment is, and this is part of the hope for today is with food waste, that you start to look at your whole operation through the lens of food waste. And through the lens of waste in general. And so what that means is you look at everything. So the pallets that come in, the shrink wrap that's being used to wrap those pallets, what are you doing with the cardboard, polystyrene, which goes under the name of styrofoam a lot of times, or the banding that's put around the pallets. A lot of times those materials can be recycled, but done in a very specialized way. And that you may or may not have the capacity to do that where you live. But again, it's to ask those questions and to see how we can reduce the amount of those materials and how we can recycle them if possible. By the way, side note, parentheses here, if you are using in your establishment styrofoam containers as disposables, please stop using them. They take hundreds and hundreds of years to break down, so please avoid that. That's an immediate win-win. We can also take a look at the containers that food is coming in. What can we recycle? Again, we have to look at, they have to be washed out, they have to be cleaned before we can put them in a compost bin. And there are certain things that we just simply can't recycle. Things like aluminum foil. Things like, if your food is being packaged in aluminum containers, if you bake lasagna in an aluminum pan, that's pretty much you cannot recycle that because it is now soiled. And if you have soiled materials going into a recycling stream, that can actually destroy many other recyclable materials. So it's an opportunity to take a look at every one of those things you're bringing into your establishment and asking that question. And by the way, buying in bulk is a great strategy, because when you buy things in large containers versus lots of little ones, you're producing less recyclable material. One other question I would just add, and I know this may not be popular in all settings, but I think as chefs, we also need to take a hard look at vacuum packing and sous vide cooking. And I know that's the darling of a lot of chefs, but that also creates a lot of waste. And so I would ask the question of, do you really need to vacuum pack, or do you really need to sous vide cook everything? Or can you actually maybe not cook it that way, or go back to ways that we used to do before all of the sous vide happened? So just something to think about, because it is very wasteful. We can also take a look at front of the house waste. In front of the house, there are lots of ways in which we can reduce the overall waste. Obviously, in a front of the house experience, we want to create something that is pleasant, that is going to be a nice experience for our customers. But again, it's an opportunity to take a look at everything we're using and say, okay, how does this contribute or not contribute to waste? What about the tablecloths we're using? Are they disposable? That contributes to waste. Do we even need tablecloths? And that's something that's happening right now around the world. And people are saying, it's a cost savings not to use tablecloths. And of course, then, you don't have to launder them, or you don't have to throw them out if they're disposable. What about the table centerpieces? I cannot tell you how many banquets I've been invited to where you see the table centerpieces are specialized or whatever, and then they go in the garbage when it's over. What a waste. Can we do table centerpieces that you can use over and over again? Or if you want to get really creative, how about putting potted plants on the tables? And when you're done, you donate those plants to schools, you donate them to people who can actually put them in the ground and plant them. Now that also makes a great marketing and PR story as well. And it's beautiful. What about things like flower arrangements? Now flower arrangements are compostable. The problem there is a lot of times when the florists make them, they also add other things to them or wrap them in wire or something, and those are not, those have to be removed before they're composted. We can also take a look at disposables and what we're doing in terms of serving. And just really quickly here, the rule of thumb is, if you can avoid serving with disposable forks, spoons, plates, bowls, etc., and use things that are washable, that is always, always, always preferable and uses far less resources and energy and water, always. Now, in certain circumstances where you don't have an option and you need to, perhaps have disposables, it's really important to look at what you're using and what those disposables are. Today, there's been a big push to move towards compostable disposables. Awesome, I get that. But it only makes sense if you have a compost bin and they're actually going to be composted. I've seen many things where, hotels will do this. We're so proud to be using all compostable stuff, and then it goes into a landfill. Well, that doesn't actually solve any problems. Sometimes actually you can maybe use, plastics that can be, washed and recycled. Again, lots of possible solutions, and by the way, there's a big movement against straws. Do we actually need straws? So I'm going to skip over this because I pretty much just covered it. And then this is where we're going to wrap up today. And I want to just jump back to the business perspective for a minute, because looking at waste and food waste and reducing it is simply good business. Yes, it's great for the environment. Yes, today, if we are able to tackle food waste, by doing so, we're able to affect everything. Because if we reduce food waste, we reduce the amount of food that's grown, all the resources that go into it, and the energy and the water needed to grow it, transport it, cook it, etc. So that's why a lot of places today, a lot of people are focusing on food waste as the vehicle to improve the environment. But from us in a business, it makes great sense. So, focusing on food waste improves profitability. It just does. And, we need to implement this as a KPI in our daily kitchen operations. We measure a lot of things in our kitchens. We keep records of things in our kitchens. We need to do the same with the waste that we produce, because the data is clear. When we do that, when we set goals, we reduce the amount of food waste, and then you're buying less food, and that is advantageous for profitability. Recycling, like things like oil, we can add to our revenue, or at the very least, do it kind of where it doesn't cost anymore to remove it. Sustainably focused restaurants. This is not just about waste, but everything we do attracts customers who demand eco-friendly practices, and that is a growing population. And it can be a very important point of differentiation that your food service establishment cares about the planet and cares enough to make the decisions you've made. And lastly, when you are sustainably focused in your kitchens, it also tends to attract people who want to work in those environments. And those people tend to be very committed and can become your sustainability, foot soldiers right along with you every day. So with that, I am going to wrap up this presentation. I want to thank you once again for being part of these 7 days. And we're going to give you a quiz in a minute, but before I do that, just a couple things real quickly. Number one, we have spent these last 7 times together. I'm going to get off of this. There we go. I have been overjoyed. I've been honored to be on the other side of your computer screen for all these days. It has been exceedingly meaningful for me. But the question I leave all of you with today is, now what? Now you have had some education. Now what are you going to do? If you walk away from this and kind of say, that was nice, and go on with your life and nothing changes, was that actually time well spent? But if indeed you walk away from this and you say, I need to learn more about this, or you walk away from this and you say, you know what? I need to look at food waste in my kitchen, or I need to look at maintenance, or maybe I need to look at behaviors, or I need to look at the food I'm buying, or how can I serve more vegetables? And if you walk away and you do that, then this was time exceptionally well spent. And so I encourage you and I challenge all of you. Action now is the next step, and tell us what you do. Now, we are also going to be having a neat little Feed the Planet community on the Worldchefs platform. You're going to get information about that. Please stay in touch with us. Tell us what you're doing. Let's keep the communication alive and well. I'll also have Lynn publish my Instagram and all of that as well.